recycling a dangerous deception? Why chemical recycling won't solve the plastic pollution problem. This is a comprehensive 159-page report. It is well documented with almost 600 citations, and it is co-published by Beyond Plastics and IPEN, which is the International Pollutants Elimination Network, and it's been a real pleasure working with our friends and colleagues at IPEN. The report was just dropped in the chat. It's also on our website, beyondplastics.org. We have 3 speakers today, including myself, who will all be sharing findings and recommendations from the report before we open up the conversation to questions. Before we start, I want to mention that if you read the report prior to November 15th, we have made a couple of revisions, which are now reflected in the report found at the link that we just dropped in the chat. I'm going to briefly read the errata, which falls just after page 5, so you're aware of the changes. The changes involve the Altera facility constructed in Akron, Ohio. On pages 8 and 87 of the report, we previously reported that even at a reduced production level, Altera was, quote, nearly reaching the limits of its air emissions permit, closed quote, and that state air quality officials in Ohio had twice given Altera permission to temporarily exceed their air emissions limits. Our original analysis of the regulatory documents were inaccurate. The language in the Ohio EPA letter was unclear. In fact, Ohio EPA was giving Altera permission to temporarily operate at a higher production level until new stack emission tests could be conducted at a higher production level. Further review of regulatory documents shows that Altera is not nearly reaching or exceeding its air emission limits. Now, let's dive into the report. Our research shows that chemical recycling is more of a marketing or lobbying tactic by the petrochemical industry than an actual solution to the problem of plastic waste. What's really interesting is take a look at the foreword of this report. It's written by a gentleman, Lou Freeman. Freeman is a former vice president for government affairs at the Society of the Plastics Industry, where he worked from 1979 to 2001. That plastics industry group is now known as the Plastics Industry Association. This is a very timely report. We just saw the 3rd meeting of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, part of the UN, is working to develop an international plastics treaty. That meeting just took place from November 13th to November 19th in Nairobi, Kenya. Our colleague who you'll hear from, Lee Bell, was there. And the next International Plastics Treaty meeting will take place in April 2024 in Ottawa, Canada. Currently, the draft Plastics International Treaty does not allow for chemical recycling as a solution. But we know that the plastics, chemical, and fossil fuel companies have been working overtime to get it included. And unfortunately, there has not been clarity on the US position from the Biden administration yet. Let me give you a quick overview of the problem. As plastic production has skyrocketed over the past 5 decades, we have witnessed a parallel increase in the environmental challenges. The World Economic Forum predicts that unless new plastic reduction policies are put in place, plastic pollution will triple by 2060. Yes, triple. Unfortunately, plastic production facilities, waste incinerators, and landfills are often put in low-income communities and/or communities of color, making plastics an important environmental justice issue. We are now seeing the same trend with so-called chemical recycling facilities. Microplastics are tiny plastic particles of less than 5 millimeters. They've been found everywhere, including the highest of mountains, the deepest parts of the ocean, our lakes, rivers, clouds, rainfall, and in the air that we breathe. There have been peer-reviewed scientific papers documenting the presence of microplastics in human bodies, including our blood, lungs, breast milk, and the human placenta. The plastics industry knows it has a big problem and has spent decades deceiving the public into thinking that plastics recycling is the answer. It's not, and the plastics industry knows that. Let me be clear. I am a big supporter of recycling. As a volunteer, I started my town's recycling program. We should all keep recycling paper, cardboard, glass, metal. Please compost yard waste and food waste. But plastic recycling in the US has been an abysmal failure. And right now, the plastics recycling rate is only about 5 to 6%. And I want to explain why traditional plastic recycling has been a failure and will never work, because the same problems plague so-called chemical recycling. There are just many different plastic polymers, thousands of different chemical additives, and many different colorants. So for instance, in your own home, you might have a blue plastic container like this. You might have a dreadful single-use plastic bag like this. You might have a coffee package like this. You might have a yellow mustard container like this. I picked this up off the side of the road. It was run over by a car. I don't know why people litter mustard. So all of these plastics have different chemical additives. All of these plastics are different colors. They're different polymers. They cannot be recycled together. It's not like an aluminum can where you can recycle an old aluminum can into a new aluminum can. The plastics are just too diverse, and by definition, the material is not easily recyclable. Similar problems will plague chemical recycling. You cannot mix up all of these different plastic polymers, colors, and chemical additives and so-called chemical recycle it together. You know who knows this the best? The plastics industry. They have known all along that more than 90% of plastics are not recyclable. But they have spent millions of dollars advertising, saying just the opposite. So what's going on? When I appear before county legislatures or city councils supporting, for instance, a plastic bag ban, a polystyrene ban, for years, I was met by our friends in the plastics industry, and they would testify at hearings and say, don't ban plastic bags. We can recycle them. That wasn't true then. It's not true now. But people are well informed, especially policymakers, on the shortcomings of conventional recycling. So now our friends in the plastics and fossil fuel and chemistry and chemical industry show up and say, don't ban plastic bags, don't do skip the stuff policies. We can rely on chemical recycling. That also is not accurate. So the plastics industry has launched this lobbying and marketing campaign promoting what it calls advanced recycling. It's not advanced, and it's not recycling. Companies claim that this approach can turn plastic waste into new plastic and solve the plastic crisis. Once again, they are wrong. And a new study recently came out that found that recycled plastic contains more chemicals than original plastics. The study detected 491 chemicals in recycled plastic pellets. The study co-author, Dr. Erica Carmona Martinez, said that plastics act as a Trojan horse, absorbing chemicals it comes in contact with the potential of these compounds being later released into the environment. So our new report, released on Halloween, Chemical Recycling, a Dangerous Deception, explains in great detail the problems with chemical recycling and why it really is not a viable solution to the plastic pollution problem. What is chemical recycling anyway? Chemical recycling, or what the industry calls advanced recycling, refers to a set of technologies and processes that attempt to use high heat, pressure, and/or solvents to break plastic into gases, chemicals, oils, tars, or waxes. It also often produces toxic substances as byproducts. It goes by many different names, depending on the process and the day. Most common are pyrolysis and gasification, which primarily turns plastic waste into fuel. Another category is solvolysis, using toxic solvents at high temperatures and pressure to cause chemical reactions that attempt to break down plastic into its component monomers. And then there is the plastic industry unicorn, turning old plastic into new plastics, and that's referred to as repolymerization. The handful of facilities in the United States that are actually operating mostly turn plastics into climate warming fossil fuels. The last thing we need. We looked at 11 facilities profiled in this report, and it's only 11 in the whole country that have been constructed. 3 exclusively make feedstocks for new plastics, 3 exclusively make fuels, and the rest attempt to make a combination of plastic feedstocks, fuels, and/or chemicals. As our report explains, there are several major problems with chemical recycling. Most notably, it does not work at scale. The other major problems are it creates new pollution, it's energy intensive, it's expensive and often relies on taxpayer or public subsidies, it poses risks to low-income communities, and it only handles a very small amount of plastic waste. It's not a solution. Some of our findings. Our report finds that chemical recycling is nothing new. We keep hearing from the chemical industry lobbyists that a breakthrough is right around the corner. Well, these technologies have failed for decades. They continue to fail. And we found no evidence to suggest that it will contribute significantly to solving the plastic problem. Chemical recycling goes all the way back to the 1980s, my favorite decade, when Disney World built a pyrolysis facility in Florida to process waste and create a substitute for oil that it could use to power its operations. The plant opened in 1982, and it closed shortly afterward when Disney realized the plant was more expensive than it had anticipated and required more gas and twice as much electricity to operate as originally projected. The idea of using plastic waste to make new plastics has also been attempted for decades. For example, in 1991, Eastman Chemical Company announced its plans to produce PET plastic with recycled PET into raw materials that would be blended with virgin plastic feedstock at the Carolina Eastman Company. Eastman announced that it would produce about 50 million pounds of plastic a year. That never happened. We keep hearing that the breakthrough is just around the corner. We've been hearing this for decades, and today there are only 11 constructed facilities in the US, many of which are not operating at capacity. Here's a really important point I want you to write down. Even if all 11 of the operating, even if all 11 of these constructed facilities were operating at full capacity with no supply challenges, no mechanical disruptions, they'd handle only 460,000 tons of plastic waste annually, or about 1.3% of the plastic waste generated in the United States. 1.3% of the plastic waste generated in the United States. Third, chemical recycling facilities are hazardous waste generators. They are a hazard to human health, particularly in environmental justice communities where they are located, which my colleague Jennifer Congdon will go into more detail. 4 of the 11 U.S. facilities are actually registered with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency as generators of hazardous waste. So why is chemical recycling being touted as a solution? It's not a solution. It's a slick marketing and lobbying campaign. So why all the hype about chemical recycling? Because there's growing public awareness about the problems with plastics. And as I've said before, plastics are in our bodies, they're damaging rivers and the ocean, and they're in the air we breathe. So it's no surprise that the public is expecting lawmakers to do something. We are very pleased that New York Attorney General Letitia James recently sued Pepsi for Pepsi's plastic packaging that is polluting the Buffalo River. There are a number of legislative proposals, such as plastic bag bans, polystyrene bans, and comprehensive packaging reduction legislation, previously known as extended producer responsibility. These policies can actually move us closer to solving the problem by reducing the amount of plastic produced when consumed. But the plastic industry doesn't want their production or their profits reduced. They need to say something to block these important new public policies. For years, they said, don't reduce plastics, recycle it. We know that was a lie. Their new line is, don't reduce plastics, chemically recycle it. But that also is not a solution. At this point, I'd like to introduce Lee Bell, a technical and policy advisor at International Pollutants Elimination Network, a leading environmental advocacy organization known as IPEN. Lee has 30 years of experience in hazardous waste treatment technology research, including pyrolysis, gasification, and incineration processes. Lee is the key author of this report and will now speak more to our findings. Lee, you're on mute. Jennifer, can you take him off mute? I had the same problem before. Maybe take everyone off mute.
It's okay. I think I'm with you now.
Yes,
can you hear me?
We can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And good evening to you all. And thank you for the opportunity to speak a little further about our report. Firstly, I'd like to say our report is a comprehensive review of chemical recycling of plastic waste. It looks at decades of evidence and peer-reviewed literature in relation to the operation of and attempts at recycling plastic using these chemical recycling methods. And as a result of looking at that evidence, we found that chemical recycling has never been an economically or environmentally safe way to manage plastic waste. And there's no evidence to suggest that this will change anytime soon. In short, chemical recycling will not help resolve the plastics crisis. And we're not alone in this finding. A recent report by the Nordic Council, which is the official inter-parliamentary body of government representatives of Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, the Faroe Islands, Greenland, and Ireland, found that in a best case scenario, this is a best case scenario, chemical recycling would only process around 3% of plastic waste projected to be generated in 2040. And the report itself questioned whether using the technology would even be worthwhile, given the massive amounts of toxic waste produced by chemical recycling and the other environmental problems associated with the technology, which include hazardous emissions to air, some of them at extraordinarily higher risk levels to those who are exposed. And the trade-off in the Nordic Council report, in their assessment, their view was this 3% of plastic waste, or 14 million tonnes of plastic waste, may be better off being produced than allowing chemical recycling to treat it because of the implications of the impact. But back to our report, our review found that a number of the significant problems with chemical recycling, and to summarise a few of those key findings, firstly, because plastics are made with toxic chemical additives and other materials, the products and the waste from chemical recycling often retain these chemicals. And when released, these chemicals pose a threat to human health and to the environment. This is especially harmful in environmental justice communities where chemical recycling operations are often located, and this compounds the risks that are already imposed upon those communities. And many of them are dealing with cumulative risks and cumulative pollution from many other types of facilities, including petrochemical refineries, which are the, if you like, similar operations to some of the plastic processing operations and production. So in the situation of environmental justice communities, we're very concerned about any widespread expansion of chemical recycling activities because of the risk that it presents to them. Secondly, chemical recycling produces very few useful products while creating very large amounts of toxic waste. The basic principle of chemical recycling is to separate useful materials from the contaminants, and the useful materials being useful types of hydrocarbon feedstock, different types of monomers, and so on. And to purify and separate them, you need to remove a large amount of toxic material, including chemical additives. And that is why you generate significant amounts of hazardous waste from the process. Plastic waste that's collected for chemical recycling will mostly come out as either hazardous waste, emissions, or oils and waxes that contain significant amounts of contamination in their own right. And this limits their applicability to plastic recycling. Instead of solving the waste problem, chemical recycling creates a new, more toxic waste problem, and that toxic waste will either be burned or landfilled. And when I say burned, I refer to either waste incineration or cement kiln burning, all of which contributes to hazardous air emissions in the long term, as well as greenhouse gas impacts. Thirdly, chemical recycling contributes to climate change. It's a very energy intensive process, and it's an inefficient technology or group of technologies. In fact, US government researchers found that chemical recycling can create as much as 100 times more damaging climate and other environmental impacts than virgin plastic production. And finally, the vast majority of products from chemical recycling at the moment are low-grade toxic plastic fuels. And according to international standards, turning plastic waste into fuel is not considered recycling at all. So there's a serious question mark over many of the facilities that claim to be engaged in advanced recycling as to whether they're simply creating fuels to burn and perpetuating the fossil fuel hydrocarbon merry-go-round, whereby those plastics are converted back to a form of fossil fuel and burned again and released as emissions. International experts in the area that I work in the policy area of multilateral environmental agreements, such as the Basel Convention on Hazardous Waste, have also debated chemical recycling now for several years and have rejected it as an environmentally sound management technology in the plastic waste technical guidelines that are used at the global level. So it has not been accepted globally as a sound way of managing plastic waste. And this is a key issue because it has roll-on effects for things like the the plastics treaty that Judith mentioned earlier that is currently being negotiated. And it also goes to the issue of the plastics industry and associated industries wanting to have a diversion from cuts to production which may be imposed by the international treaty process. And for this reason, we remain concerned that there is more hype than substance around chemical recycling. So our report finds that this industry hype is effectively a dangerous deception because of the impacts it may have. And we recommend that chemical recycling should not be considered in plans for resolving the plastic crisis, and government should instead focus on solutions that promote significant reductions in plastic production and innovation for safer materials. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee Bell. It was just such an honor and pleasure working with you and your colleagues at IPEN on this report, and we're just so grateful for your expertise. Thank you. We now have Jennifer Congdon. Jennifer is Beyond Plastics Deputy Director and a former Assistant Secretary for the Environment in the New York State Governor's Office. Jennifer was one of the contributors to the report, particularly the case studies of the 11 constructed chemical recycling facilities in the US, and she's going to share some of the highlights of the case studies with us now.
Thank you, Judith. Excuse me. For this report, we researched each of the 11 constructed facilities in the United States that are attempting to chemically recycle plastic waste. They are not all fully operating, but they are constructed. If you see figure 5 in our report on page 38, there is a map of the facilities. This report is generous when it says that there are 11 constructed facilities because at least 4 of the facilities are operating at a pilot or demonstration scale. These are Regenix in Oregon, Altera in Ohio, New Hope in Texas, and Prima in New Hampshire. And at least 4 of the facilities are partially or intermittently operating. These are Brightmark in Indiana, Eastman in Tennessee, Nexus in Georgia, and PureCycle in Ohio. The following 8 facilities have no publicly available data about how much feedstock they have processed: Altera in Ohio, Bravin in North Carolina, Eastman in Tennessee, Exxon in Texas, Fulcrum in Nevada, New Hope in Texas, Prima in New Hampshire, and PureCycle in Ohio. And nearly all of the facilities, 10, have no publicly available data on exactly what type and amount of product they have created. This is Regenix in Oregon, Altera in Akron, Ohio, Bravin in North Carolina, Brightmark in Indiana, Eastman in Tennessee, Exxon in Texas, Fulcrum in Nevada, New Hope in Texas, Prima in New Hampshire, and PureCycle in Ohio. A few key themes emerged from our research. First, we found that the US facilities are handling an insignificant amount of plastic waste. As Judith mentioned, if all of the chemical recycling facilities in the United States were operating at their full nameplate capacity, they would only be capable of processing about 1.3% of plastic waste. Yet most of the facilities are not operating at capacity. So they're processing much less. Second, many of the US facilities are struggling to create a profitable product. Examples include Agilix AS, the parent company of Regenix in Oregon, sustained operating losses of $22.4 million in 2020 and 2021. In a 2022 interview with a news outlet, a representative of Altera in Ohio indicated that the plant may not be turning a profit. Brightmark failed to secure public subsidies to build a facility in Macon County, Georgia, because it was unable to prove to the Macon-Bibb Industrial Development Authority that its plant in Ashley, Indiana, was successfully producing and selling a product. The Georgia project was abandoned when the public subsidies were not provided. Fulcrum in Nevada recently defaulted on environmental improvement revenue bonds and at the direction of debt holders, Fulcrum is in accelerated repayment. For both the New Hope facility in Texas and the Prima facility in New Hampshire, no records of any product can be found. And in March 2023, PureCycle in Ohio defaulted on its agreement with the Southern Ohio Port Authority and UMB Bank by failing to complete construction of their Ironton, Ohio project by December 2022. The default was waived with new conditions, but recent mechanical failures caused PureCycle to halt production. And recognizing that the facility would not meet a key milestone as required in its default waiver, PureCycle filed a notice of force majeure to release itself and its bondholders from their contractual obligations. From what we can tell, the facility is still not operating. Third, we found that at least 8 of the constructed facilities have produced low-quality fossil fuels that are burned, some of it on site, to power their operations. These are Regenix in Oregon, Altera in Ohio, Bravin in North Carolina, Brightmark in Indiana, Fulcrum in Nevada, Nexus in Georgia, New Hope in Texas, and Prima in New Hampshire. Fourth, we found that lack of transparency makes it difficult to determine how much chemical recycling costs and the amounts and types of outputs. For example, major data gaps exist for chemical recycling's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, even though many of these facilities burn fossil fuels as part of the process to run their technology. Fifth, we determined that chemical recycling is expensive and risky, yet it has attracted large public and private subsidies, public subsidies and private investments. We found that 5 of the 11 plants have secured some direct public subsidies. These are Altera in Ohio, Brightmark in Indiana, Eastman in Tennessee, Exxon in Texas, Fulcrum in Nevada, and PureCycle in Ohio. One notable subsidy is the $100 million in federal grants and state tax abatements for Fulcrum Sierra's biofuels plant in Nevada, which very recently defaulted on $290 million in environmental improvement revenue bonds and is now in accelerated repayment at the direction of debt holders. Sixth, we found that these facilities are harmful to the environment and human health. One notable example of this is the Regenix facility in Tigard, Oregon, which produced more than 1,200 tons of hazardous waste between 2011 and 2021, according to US EPA records. This means that Regenix has produced about 1 ton of hazardous waste for every 3 tons of plastic waste that it has processed. Overall, we found that 4 of the 11 facilities are registered with the EPA as hazardous waste generators. These are Regenix in Oregon, Altera in Ohio, Bravin in North Carolina, and PureCycle in Ohio. 2 of the projects, Eastman's in Tennessee and Exxon's in Texas, are embedded within larger facilities that are classified as large generators of hazardous waste. And finally, we found that these facilities are mostly impacting already overburdened environmental justice communities, and that a further build out of this industry is a threat to environmental justice. Please see Figure 6 on page 40 of our report for a chart illustrating this point. We found that 8 of the 11 plants are located in areas with lower than average levels of income compared to the national average. These are Altera in Ohio, Bravin in North Carolina, Eastman in Tennessee, Exxon in Texas, New Hope in Texas, Nexus in Georgia, Prima in New Hampshire, and PureCycle in Ohio. And 5 of the facilities are located in communities that have higher than average concentrations of people of color than the rest of the country. These are Bravin in North Carolina, Exxon in Texas, Fulcrum in Nevada, New Hope in Texas, and Nexus in Georgia. For example, reporting by The Intercept in 2023 found that even before the Bravin facility in North Carolina started operating, residents of a census tract within 1 mile already had higher particulate matter and ozone exposure, hazardous waste proximity, and air toxics cancer risk than over 90% of the country. In conclusion, the landscape of chemical recycling in the United States is littered with pollution and failure. Relying on chemical recycling to process plastic waste is an unreliable and polluting approach to solve the growing problem of plastic pollution. Back to you, Judith.
Thank you so much, Jennifer Congdon. And I want to thank again Jennifer Congdon, Lee Bell with IPEN, and Jenny Gitlitz with Beyond Plastics for their really hard work on this breakthrough report. It's pretty obvious that the plastic pollution crisis is a global concern that requires effective action. One of our major messages is that policymakers should not be distracted by the false solution of chemical recycling. The plastics industry has been working hard to weaken environmental regulations around chemical recycling, particularly in the US. They've already successfully lobbied to pass 24 new laws in 24 states to classify these polluting facilities as manufacturing rather than waste disposal. That may seem like a dorky little distinction, but if you're classified as manufacturing and not a waste disposal facility, you're subject to less environmental oversight and regulation, and you're more likely to be able to secure public subsidies. But chemical recycling is a threat to our health, especially low-income communities and communities of color. In light of our findings in this report, we have recommended a series of actions that should be taken at the federal and state levels to address chemical recycling. First, we're calling on the Biden administration to declare a national moratorium on new chemical recycling facilities. President Biden should direct the EPA to do three things. First, require extensive analysis and testing of existing chemical recycling plants' air emissions. Please test their waste residues and their health and safety risks, including for workers at these facilities. Second, deny permits for chemical recycling plants if they pose these risks. And third, mandate testing of chemical recycling outputs in order to prevent contamination. In addition, at the state, regional, and local level, number one, please end all public incentives for establishing chemical recycling plants. Prohibit chemical recycling in environmental justice communities. Prohibit waste to fuel projects, and do not allow chemical recycling in all of its incarnations, whether you call it chemical recycling, advanced recycling, pyrolysis, gasification, solvolysis. Do not allow these technologies to count as real recycling in various public policy proposals. For instance, Beyond Plastics and others are working hard to pass a comprehensive packaging reduction and recycling infrastructure act in New York State. That bill currently does not allow for chemical recycling to be considered real recycling, and certainly not plastics reduction. And the New York bill is a good model for other states. So I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. We have a little time for questions. If you have questions, please type them in the chat. And Melissa will pose some of the questions to various speakers. While we're waiting for the questions to come in, I want to tell you something you probably already know. Today is Giving Tuesday. Just in case you did not get large amounts of emails announcing Giving Tuesday, we hope that you will consider a gift to Beyond Plastics. We'll drop a link in the chat. We have a goal of raising $10,000 by midnight tonight, and I just checked and we're at $8,000. For a little group like us, $10,000 is a lot of money. So have another glass of wine, maybe two, and then please make a donation to Beyond Plastics, and also please support IPEN. They do incredibly important work worldwide. You can go to ipen.org to see how to donate to IPEN to support their amazing work. Melissa?
So we have a question from Cynthia Walter, though I am failing to see it in the chat here. Jennifer, do you want to pipe in?
Sure. Cynthia asked about fires at these facilities. And I wanted to say that we did not document that specifically in our report, although in some of the cases,
we did.
We mentioned when there were fires, but doesn't Jandel at the last beach cleanup she has a tracker on their website, and there's a map with, you can see little fires where there are fires at plastics recycling facilities, not all chemical recycling facilities, but it's definitely a risk at chemical recycling facilities.
It's a risk wherever large amounts of plastic are stored. And the report does have a map, but more current information is at thelastbeachcleanup.org. Unfortunately, plastic burns fast and it burns hot. And we have witnessed not chemical recycling facilities per se, but facilities that even just store plastic waiting to find a market. There are pretty serious fire risks. Melissa, do you want to facilitate questions? Stephanie Unter has her hand up.
Yes. I'm sorry, I'm going through the questions in the chat. They're coming in very fast. Stephanie, please chime in. Oh, 1 second. I think you should be able to unmute now.
Yes. Hi, how are you?
Good.
Good. This is wonderful. I have a question that's maybe related, kind of, but not 100% to plastics, but I think it is. I'm in the fashion industry, and I feel like a lot of waste is fashion plastics. And I feel like, it's all going into landfill. So if someone throws out their clothes or thinks they're giving it to a donation center, and they're just going into a pile. Is that considered plastic? And how does that affect, or does it like snowball into each other and it's all kind of one big mess?
About 70% of clothing has plastic in it, most notably polyester. And there is a push to do chemical recycling for carpet and for clothing. That's something that would greatly concern us. Jennifer just dropped a bill in the chat in New York. There's a bill pending in the state legislature to study this issue. Jennifer, no?
Somebody else in the chat asked for the New York packaging bill. So that's
the packaging bill.
Yeah.
There's also a bill by Senator Brad Hoylman-Siegel and an assembly member to look at the issue of fast fashion and how to deal with all the plastics in clothing and apparel. Jennifer or Lee, do you have anything to add? Now, the bigger issue, Stephanie, is also when you wash and dry your clothing, when it has plastics in it, a lot of microplastics go out the drain of your washing machine. So there is a lot of interest on our part to require that washing machine manufacturers install capture devices so that the microplastics don't go down the drain, but are captured in a filter of sorts. And then, unfortunately, you just throw that in the garbage. That is strongly opposed by the companies that make washing machines. And unfortunately, California Governor Gavin Newsom recently vetoed a bill that passed the California legislature to require the installation of these capture devices. Some would argue you've got to go upstream and get the plastic out of the clothing. I agree with that. But an interim important step is making sure that our washing machines are not major sources of microplastics as they currently are.
So they're contributing too. So it's not like me recycling fashion and promoting like buy your clothes that are used and let's, share clothing. They still have to, use the machine. So it's kind of like it's a ball that keeps rolling and we don't know where it's stopping.
It's a big problem.
And good question. We have another one that I think
you.
would be great for Lee. This is from Kevin Green. He said, have you had an opportunity to review the Argonne National Lab report for the American Chemistry Council that looked favorably on the climate impacts of chemical recycling versus making plastic from virgin feedstock?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Yes, I have been able to look at that report, and I think that one of the issues is it does contradict directly with another recent group of US government researchers who found that the impacts in terms of greenhouse gas and other environmental impacts were 10 to 100 times higher than virgin plastic production. And I think it's worth noting also that the report you refer to is funded by the American Chemistry Council. It's based on the data provenance for that report is not reproducible in the sense that you can't access it. It's based on conversations with certain people from the industry, so that the data can't be tested correctly in terms of how it appears in the Argonne Laboratory report. And the report also relies on a number of other supporting citations that have also been questioned in terms of their accuracy, in terms of greenhouse gas calculations. It's worth remembering that Argonne Laboratory report really looks at greenhouse gas emissions, and it doesn't take into account the toxicity of the emissions, that is non-greenhouse gas emissions, and it doesn't take into account the hazardous nature of the waste from the production from chemical recycling. There's a lot missing in that respect. One thing it does do is acknowledges the fact that the pyrolysis oil is significantly contaminated. And that's why it works on dilution factors of 5% and 20% when applying that particular hydrocarbon blend into the steam crackers. And this is a major problem with particularly pyrolysis, which is the main technology used for chemical recycling, is that the output oils and hydrocarbons contain very significant quantities of contaminants, including very significant toxicity characteristic contaminants like dioxins and furans. These can be transported into products made from these types of oils. They can also be released during the production processes into atmospheric emissions, and they can be released from the petrochemical and plastic production facilities that use these oils because they're entrained in the pyrolysis oil itself. And just one further point to make on that is that these levels of contamination actually restrict the ability of post-pyrolysis production to actually use these oils to make plastics. And that is why so many of them end up as fuels, because they're basically low-grade mixed hydrocarbons with a lot of contamination in them. And when they can't find a market for those, they end up going as basically low-quality, cheap fuels to be burned. Which again releases the contaminants into the atmosphere. So yes, there are a number of significant concerns about the conclusions of that Argonne Laboratory report. Thanks.
Thank you, Lee. A question for Jennifer real quick. If these facilities are not doing well financially, won't they fail on their own?
Yes. Yes, they will if they don't do well financially. And we are seeing evidence of that in some of the facilities right now. I mentioned the Fulcrum example. Pure Cycle also having financial difficulties. And a couple of the other facilities that we looked at, Prima in New Hampshire, just no evidence of any product whatsoever. So yes, they will fail on their own, but the plastics industry is using the promise of chemical recycling to prevent new policies to reduce plastic production. And so we cannot let that happen. And we'll let these ones fail if they're going to fail, but we don't need to incentivize new ones. We need to focus on reducing plastic production and the generation of plastic pollution.
We don't have any more time to waste, that's for sure. Janet, I'm glad that it's a virtual hand that was raised, because otherwise your arm would have been tired by now. So please chime in. You're going to have to unmute yourself. I think it just gave you permission.
Okay, for those of us who are planning to meet with federal legislators, I'm thinking of what are some of the talking points. Number one, do we assume that they understand a lot about chemical recycling?
No.
Number two, I have heard that in the IRA, there's a huge amount of money available I heard the term 10 billion, which sounded to me like too high, but anyway, there's a lot of money under IRA that's available to for chemical recycling companies to use. And what kinds of talking points can we use, and what leverage do existing legislators have to restrict those fees, those fund allocations, if any?
Well, Janet, that's why we wrote this report, because we find that a lot of policymakers are not aware of the problems with chemical recycling. I've heard mixed things on whether indeed it is going to get billions of dollars in the IRA or not. It is, Jennifer? Okay, that's a big problem. We are disappointed in that, and we're not Washington insiders, so we were not privy to this provision being included in the IRA. I will tell you that one thing we are following very closely, and when you meet with federal representatives, please point this out to them. Just like the American Chemistry Council state partners were able to get 24 states to reclassify chemical recycling as manufacturing, that is also being attempted in Congress at the federal level. And the American Chemistry Council has been shopping around the idea of a federal bill to classify chemical recycling as manufacturing. They've been looking for a Democrat to sponsor the bill in the US Senate, and wisely, no Democrat has yet agreed to do that. So I think the most important message at this point is to make sure that a bill like that does not advance in the Senate. Who knows what's happening in the House? It's very challenging to watch that body function or not function. So the Senate is really, really important. And then on the positive side, Senator Merkley and Representative Huffman have introduced the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. I don't remember the new bill numbers. If anyone has that handy, drop it in the chat. But urging your federal House and Senate members to co-sponsor the Merkley-Huffman Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act would be extremely helpful.
Thank you.
A common question we're getting is, at this point, should we not recycle our plastics, water bottles, and other plastic containers?
Oh boy. I still recycle number 1 and number 2, nothing else. Some waste haulers say put everything in your bin 1 through 7. That's a huge mistake. I still do number 1 and number 2, but I'm worried that some of that is being exported to other countries that do not have an infrastructure to handle this. 10 states have bottle bills. So if you live in one of the 10 bottle bill states, I think you can recycle your beverage bottles with a high level of confidence, because the stuff is really kept source separated and is kept clean and goes to real recycling facilities domestically. But that is a real question we're going to look at. I am not ready at all to say don't recycle number 1 and number 2. And you know, when you go to the supermarket, no matter how careful you are, you have no choice. There's so much plastic. Most of it is not recyclable. But don't put in your recycling bin anything other than 1 and 2.
Okay, this might be a question for Lee, but can you specify the types of emissions that are coming from recycling plants that are not captured in the installed catalyst or filters? The argument from some of the facilities is that they're removing the toxic emissions.
You're on mute. Off mute. You're
Okay,
good.
I'm with you. Yeah, so the question is essentially whether these facilities are able to filter out these contaminants during the processes. One thing they won't be able to do if they're registered as manufacturing facilities is be required to apply very high levels of pollution emission controls, as they would be if they were regulated as incinerators, which is the current status quo, at least at federal level in the US. If you're burning plastics or using processes such as pyrolysis and gasification that count as incineration processes and waste combustion processes, then you're required to meet a much higher level of pollution emission control. If you downgrade that regulation to manufacturing facilities, that may not be the case, and you may not be required to either monitor for those pollutants, put in place filters and scrubbers for those pollutants, or in other ways trap them and prevent them being released to atmosphere. However, even if you were to be regulated at the highest level, it's not possible to completely remove these contaminants, particularly from air emissions from your facilities. Even the best standards in the EU relating to state-of-the-art facilities acknowledge that you still have releases of dioxins and PAHs and particulate and other contaminants. So you might be allowed an allowable permit limit on some of these contaminants. Whether you can meet those levels through filtration and scrubbing is another matter. And what we're seeing most recently in Paris is that incineration facilities in particular are being basically held accountable for widespread dioxin pollution in Paris suburbs that has resulted in prohibition on eating homegrown eggs because of the buildup in the food chain. It only takes small amounts of dioxins to be released into the local area to start to build up in the soil and affect the food chain. So what I'm essentially saying is that they might be able to control some of the pollutants with state-of-the-art filtration and scrubbing equipment, but the record shows internationally that this is not a safeguard over the long term because these facilities often operate in conditions that allow them to bypass these filters and scrubbers, particularly where there's problems with high levels of pressure and explosive gases in the system. And if it reaches critical level, they're allowed to bypass all of those pollution control devices anyway. And on startup and shutdown processes, they release higher amounts of emissions that may actually count for, in total, more emissions during those particular startup and shutdown activities than are released during the whole year of regular operation. So there's a lot of problems with controlling these types of emissions, and that's not even going into the hazards associated with explosions and fires, which have plagued these facilities, particularly pyrolysis facilities, in the past and historically. Thanks.
Thanks, Lee. I know we're a little over. Judith, do we need to wrap up, or can we squeeze in a couple more questions?
Why don't we just do one more question and then wrap up?
Gotcha. All right. So one person said that Pennsylvania reclassified this process in the Solid Waste Management Act so that it is classified as manufacturing. Is there a movement to undo this in other states that have done the same?
Yes, and advocates in Pennsylvania should try to get this undone. I noticed Joe Minute from Clean Air Council has joined us tonight. They're a leading environmental protection group in Pennsylvania, and there is a lot of interest in trying to reverse these policies, whether done through state legislation or through solid waste regulations. It's really, it's hard once it's been adopted, but it's really worth the effort to try to get it reversed. And I think lawmakers and regulators know a whole lot more today than they did a year or 2 or 3 years ago when this was adopted. And please send them our report. It's long, but we wrote it so that it would be helpful for decision makers who are taking a very close look at this. This is not a 5-page fact sheet. This is a thoroughly researched report that policymakers can rely on. So please send the link to the report to your own elected officials, to your state environmental commissioner, and use this to try to reverse some of those irresponsible bills that were passed with very little public scrutiny.
And sorry, sending the correct link again in a second, right here. But just an FYI that we also have a summary of the report that's just a shorter version with our key findings and recommendations. That's an easy printout too if you need an easy handout, and that can be found on our landing page.
Thank you, everyone. The good news is I didn't give you my cold over Zoom. The benefit of Zoom. Thank you for joining us. Lots of information on the Beyond Plastics and IPEN website. And happy Giving Tuesday. Good night.
Thank you all.